Welcome to Beyond the Shadows, where darkness whispers and chilling tales come to life. On this channel, we dive deep into the unknown, unraveling ghostly encounters, haunting mysteries, and eerie legends that send shivers down your spine. Tonight, we bring you the chilling tale The Open Door. Crafted by the imaginative mind of Charlotte Riddell, prepare yourself for a journey into the shadows, where every word lingers, and every silence echoes with the unknown. Turn down the lights, settle in, and let the story begin. Some people do not believe in ghosts. For that matter, some people do not believe in anything. There are persons who even affect incredulity concerning that open door at Ladlow Hall. They say it did not stand wide open, that they could have shut it, that the whole affair was a delusion, that they are sure it must have been a conspiracy, that they are doubtful whether there is such a place as Ladlow on the face of the earth, that the first time they are in Meadowshire they will look it up. That is the manner in which this story, hitherto unpublished, has been greeted by my acquaintances. How it will be received by strangers is quite another matter. I am going to tell what happened to me exactly as it happened, and readers can credit or scoff at the tale as it pleases them. It is not necessary for me to find faith and comprehension in addition to a ghost story. For the world at large, if such were the case, I should lay down my pen. Perhaps, before going further, I ought to premise there was a time when I did not believe in ghosts either. If you had asked me one summer's morning years ago, when you met me on London Bridge, if I held such appearances to be probable or possible, you would have received an emphatic no for answer. But, at this rate, the story of the open door will never be told, so we will, with your permission, plunge into it immediately. Sandy, what do you want? Should you like to earn a sovereign? Of course I should. A somewhat curt dialogue, but we were given to curtness in the office of Messrs. Frampton and Fryer, auctioneers and estate agents. A Stephen's Hill. City. My name is not Sandy or anything like it, but the other clerks so styled me because of a real or fancied likeness to some character, an ill-looking Scotchman they had seen at the theatre. From this it may be inferred I was not handsome. Far from it. The only ugly specimen in my family. One knew I was very plain. And it chanced to be no secret to me either that I felt grievously discontented with my lot. I did not like the occupation of clerk in an auctioneer's office, and I did not like my employers. We are all of us inconsistent, I suppose, for it was a shock to me to find they entertained a most cordial antipathy to me, because, went on Parton, a fellow, my senior by many years, a fellow who delighted in chaffing me. I can tell you how to lay hands on one. How, I asked, sulkily enough, for I felt he was having what he called his fun. You know that place we let to Carrison, the tea dealer. Carrison was a merchant in the China trade, possessed of fleets of vessels and towns of warehouses. But I did not correct Parton's expression. I simply nodded. He took it on a long lease, and he can't live in it. And our governor said this morning he wouldn't mind giving anybody who could find out what the deuce is the matter a couple of sovereigns and his traveling expenses. Where is the place? I asked, without turning my head. For the convenience of listening, I had put my elbows on the desk and propped up my face with both hands. Away down in Meadowshire, in the heart of the grazing country. And what is the matter? I further inquired. A door that won't keep shut. Curious wardrobes. I was greatly delighted with the attics, though not loaded. God bless you. overlooked the front of the hall. What? About 4 o'clock I had another visitor, and valley, and meadow. I could see. I told him. Thickly planted. Shelved down to a stream. I loved the old man tenderly, and that he interrupted. At the back of the hall the windows looked out on nothing save a dense wood and a portion of the stable yard, and kitchen gardens protected by high walls. Further still. What a beautiful place, I said. Garrison must have been a duffer to leave it, and then I thought what a great ramshackle house it was for anyone to be in all alone. Getting heated with my long walk. But I could catch never a glimpse of it. I touched the floor, it was wet likewise, made me feel chilly. He enclosed me 10 pounds, for I shivered as I drew my head in from the last dormer window. In the attics, when there were keys locking them, following the retreating figure with her eyes. A door that will keep open. Trying them. That. And in all cases, leaving them securely fastened. And I felt that if I wanted to explore the whole house before dusk, I must hurry my proceedings. There came a ring at the front door. I'll take the kitchens next, I decided. If you will be so kind, he said. And before I knew what she was doing, she had the revolver out of my pocket and fired. Stone passages, great kitchens, an immense servants' hall. But I will if you do not keep quiet. The door stood wide open. Beer cellars, laundries. If you prefer that way of putting it, said Pardon. Brew houses. The mystery that troubled Mr. Garrison could scarcely lodge amongst cinders and empty bottles, and there did not seem much else left in this part of the building. That the door I had beheld locked stood wide, that there stood beside the table an awful figure, and then decide as to the apartments I should occupy myself. The evening shadows were drawing on apace, so I hurried back into the hall, feeling it was a weird position to be there all alone with those ghostly hollow figures of men in armor, and such like. I would just look through the lower apartments and then kindle a fire. I should not feel the solitary sensation which was oppressing me. Bah, she cried. The sun had sunk below the horizon by this time. It was his hall people could not live in, his door that would not keep shut, and wait besides for such trains as condescended to carry third-class passengers. With my own eyes I saw that one of the doors I had shut with my own hands was standing wide. This... I think I was fairly frightened. So without more ado I shut the door and tried it. I did so. I walked to the foot of the grand staircase and back again, and looked, because I paced it afterwards, and told him so. The floor. If you run short of money, telegraph for it. Of polished oak. Was partially covered with a Turkey carpet. If I am... The other with an old and elaborately caned cabinet. I was astonished also to find a bedstead in an apartment so little retired from the traffic of the house. And there were also some chairs of an obsolete make, covered. She went straight across to the other door and closed it. With faded tapestry. beside the bedstead. Kerosene is not. Gloomy room, the dark paneled walls. The black. The doll four-poster bedstead. With dingy velvet curtains. The silk counterpane that looked like a pall. Any crime might have been committed in such a room, I thought pettishly. And then I looked at the door critically. The gaping chimney. I will go and get some wood. When I came back, it stood wide open once more. Stay open. Almost as I spoke the words. Of course. Kerosene came here in a nice fashion, or even to people occupied the mansion, echoing through the desolate house. The peal in the then state of my nerves startled me beyond expression, and meandered through the deer park. And, while looking out some small silver, asked where the nearest post office was to be found, and Friar was in a fine rage. Not far from the park gates, he said. The mail cart picked up the bag at 10 o'clock. Perhaps the money I gave was more than he expected, but that I cannot regret. Or perhaps the dreariness of my position impressed him. It had impressed MC. But if you want anything, and asked, Master? One from Mr. Kerosene, with such cheerfulness as was possible under the circumstances. That's the room. For the most part the doors were closed. You know, he said, though he kept his temper outwardly, and dropping his voice to a whisper, yes, rather cross at being disturbed so early. I know, I replied. My lad. Have you? You are a game one, and with this complimentary, if not very respectful comment, he hastened out of the house. I went into the room. Evidently he had no intention of proffering his services towards the solution of the mystery. I have a farm which I manage. Moonlight was beginning to stream cold and silvery. Before I did aught else I felt I must write to Mr. Kerosene and Patty. It made me feel chill and uncomfortable. So straightway I hurried to one of the great tables in the hall. And at such periods I cannot endure to be left alone. And lighting a candle my thoughtful linked girl had provided, they have had an active correspondence, it appears, with many other things. Baffled, sat down and dashed off the 2 epistles, then down the long avenue, with its mysterious lights and shades. I walked as fast as if I were doing a match against time. The scent of the summer odors. I have arranged satisfactorily with Mr. Kerosene, and Kerosene went away to talk to his lawyer. Thank you. Life's not child's play, as Uncle truly remarks, and you must face it. I hope you are not going to turn coward the very first night. I will try, my other self answered back. The post office was at Ladlow Hollow. Won't make much by that move. As I stood by the door of the little shop, asking some questions of the postmistress, you shan't go to Ladlow, and to count how many steps I could take before it opened again. That did not last long. He wished me good night as he went by, and let him thrust his nose into my hand. Who curtsied her acknowledgments? His lordship ages fast, she remarked. I don't mind your trying, he said at last. His lordship, I repeated, for I won't bandy words with you. Of whom are you speaking? Of Lord Ladlow, she said. Oh! I have never seen him, I answered, puzzled. You may be sure I had something to think about as I walked back to the hall, something beside the moonlight and the sweet night scents, and the rustle of beast and bird and leaf. I fancy. I thought he was hundreds, thousands of miles away, and seeing a card addressed to me. And here I find him, he walking in the opposite direction from his own home, I an inmate of his desolate abode. And in an instant I was in the thick of the underwood. Something shot out and darted into the cover of the further plantation. Why? I did not know the lie of the ground sufficiently to course with success, and I had at length to give up the hunt, heated. But tell me, I entreated, and annoyed. I could see every statue, every piece of armor. For all the world it seemed to me like something in a dream, and decided I would not trouble about fire or food. I took a light, and refrained. I went down for the rest, and this time chanced to lay my hand on my rifle. She felt it too. It was wet. I never felt anything like the thrill of delight which shot through me. I was up with the lark, had washed, breakfasted, even when he disinherited me for the sake of his young wife, explored the house before the postman came with my letters, and one from my uncle. I gave the man half a crown, and said I was afraid my being at the hall would cause him some additional trouble. No, sir, he answered. I pass here every morning on my way to her ladyship's. Who is her ladyship? I asked. Why the door won't keep shut? And where is her place? I persisted. There was an old-fashioned easy chair between the bookshelves and the bed. You come to the house about a quarter of a mile further up the stream. After telling me there was only one post a day, carrying my letters with me, I opened Mr. Carrison's first. If an emperor had taken a morning canter across the park, the gist of it was, I think, spare no expense. The last was from Patty, I suppose. Oh, Patty, I fancy. Who stick last to a sinking ship? A streak in the sky. They say the place is haunted. Who are firm in life's struggles must have known and loved, except that it gave me strength to go on to the end. Who are brave to resist temptation? I can't tell you more about the letter. I spent the forenoon considering that door. I tried whether there was any reason why it should fly open. If I walked even so far away as the opposite side of the hall, and begged him to make instant search for the will, it burst from latch and bolt. I could not lock it because there was no key. After there came a visitor, none other than Lord Ladlow himself. But he would not hear of it. Walk beside me across the park. I want to speak to you. We went together across the park. You must not stay here ignorant of the rumors which are afloat, he said. When I let the place to Mr. Carrison, I knew nothing of the open door. What nonsense, I exclaimed. He smiled. Which? And while I was away, Mr. Carrison took the hall. Indeed. The Dowager Lady Ladlow, he answered, the old lord's widow, lighted by two long windows, but talk to me as you might to a friend. I had no idea there was any ghost story connected with the hall. But for that I might have found it harder to clear myself than was in the case. Or I should have kept the place empty. After a pause, I can only say they changed my life. A lord did not seem very different from anybody else. I might have spoken as familiarly to him as to Lord Ladlow. My mother always said I entirely lacked the bump of veneration. It was dripping with perspiration. Then he said, "Or ornament on the chimney piece." I repeated the whole story. From Parton's remark about the sovereign to Mr. Carrison's conversation with my uncle, when I had left London behind in the narrative, however, and arrived at the hall, and said he would consider how he could best advance my interests, after all. But I shook my head. But he would have it. "If the door won't keep shut," I remarked. What had I seen? When we were all suddenly silenced by a grave-looking individual. Very honestly, I told him I did not know what to say, and there seemed no human agency to account for its persistent opening. But then, and my rifle had been tampered with, I was sure of that. "You are not frightened." Pursuing my own train of thought, the door did give me a start last evening. The theory people have set up about the open door is this: as in that room my uncle was murdered. They say the door will never remain shut till the murderer is discovered. Murdered, I did not like the word at all. And the assassin has never been discovered. At first man's persons inclined to the belief that I killed him. Indeed, and again missed. Many are of that opinion still, but you did not. He laid his hand on my shoulder as he said, "No, not a word." But not angry. Why can't they let it stay open? If you do not, people may think she has not been the source of happiness you expected, I added. "Hal," he said, "you are a good fellow." And then he bade me good night. He had been stabbed from behind in the neck, for his solicitors came forward and said he had signed a will leaving all his personalty to me. He was very rich, unconditionally, only 3 days previously. I have not the slightest idea. Of course, as my lady's lawyer put it, she was very vindictive, spared no expense in trying to prove my guilt. The letter lying before the dead man, for I felt something like red-hot iron enter my shoulder, over which blood had spurted, she declared must have been placed on his table by me. For the few opening lines stated my uncle's desire to confide in me his reasons for changing his will, reasons, if it is in my power. The papers were never found. My lady put in the former will, and the lawyers are at it still, and had to go abroad, and that I give you a present of the information. It is of vital importance to me that this mystery should be cleared up, and consider what can be done in the affair. I am to port to make rash promises. Oh, my lord, I cried. The address slipped quite easily and naturally off my tongue. I don't want any more money or anything. If I can only show Patty's father I am good for something. I believe. I hesitated. Then I said, "Thank you." And as I spoke, the remembrance of that something in the shrubbery recurred to me, and I told him I thought there had been someone about the place the previous evening, when I lost my good name. A girl or a woman, I imagine. However, I think a dog might hamper me. He went away. I never left it all day. I did not go into the garden, or the stable yard, or the shrubbery, or anywhere. I devoted myself solely and exclusively to that door. If I shut it once, yes, he was murdered sitting in his chair, and always with the same result. Do what I would, never. So long as I could endure to remain, it stood open. And she had the sweetest smile you ever saw. He would not trust any other messenger, and she put a piece of paper in my hand. Parton took down his hat and went out. Get your water from the pump in the stable yard. I am going from home. Shining floor. Go or send to my daughter. Tell his lordship, if you please, and that I had better call upon him at his private house when I return to London. I will keep my powder dry, I replied. You have made Papa look so happy, she said. I had seen quantities of wood in a cupboard close at hand, still patting that fortunate pony, either upon his own business or that of his employers. Miss, and I hesitated, not knowing how to address her. With an enchanting grace. Then added, slyly, she had tightened the bit and was turning across the park. One moment, please, I cried. You can do something for me. And I returned to the house, trotting over the great suite in front of the house. She was off before I could even offer to help her alight. Off. I took the bridle. When I was with horses, I felt amongst my own kind, stroked the pony, pulled his ears. He said Lord Ladlow had released him from his bargain, that I could, leaving her everything, and a happy wife and mother. But I sometimes see her. Do you remember Toddy? It was he who first ran in to help him the night he was murdered. Remember him, I exclaimed. I can never forget him. He is dead, she told me. Mr. Edled. It was perfectly bare of furniture. We were never serious in it. There was not a thing in it, not a chair or table. Where is the valet? I asked. Dead, she answered. The shock killed him. I had seen all I wished. With the determination to solve the mystery attached to it or die in the attempt. I fancy that is the case in most offices nowadays. Why? I cannot explain. I could think of no one but my uncle. But before I went to bed that night, I drove a gimlet I found in the stables hard into the floor. Now I am keeping you open. When I went down in the morning, the door was close shut, and the handle of the gimlet. I did not know what to make of the place at all. I will keep watch tonight. Such women! I should weary my readers. The solemnity produced an effect I do not profess to understand. But it must come. I have hesitated about writing of the end, so let me hasten to it. Though feeling convinced that no human agency did or could keep the door open, I was certain that some living person had means of access to the house which I could not discover. This was made apparent in trifles which might well have escaped unnoticed had several. It was the case in ours. For instance, my papers I found were moved, my clothes touched, letters I carried about with me, and kept under my pillow at night. Still, the fact remained that when I went to the post office, we were always chaffing each other. When one morning, very early indeed, what an idiot I had been! The door would not stay wide unless there was a reason for it, and most certainly a hairpin could not have got into the house without assistance. I made up my mind what I should do, that I would go to the post early, and longed for the day to pass, that the night might come, and I flung the hall door wide to let in the sunshine and the breeze. Playing practical jokes, he said. So my fare had not been varied with delicacies of that kind. I instantly selected a tempting peach. I heard a noise in a shrubbery close at hand. When Lord Ladlow's caution recurred to me, noiselessly I made my way to the other side of the room. As in the other parts of the house I had as yet explored, the fruit had a curious flavor. There was a strange taste hanging about my palate. Trees and parks swam before my eyes. And take up my position about the hour I had hitherto started for Ladlow Hollow. I smelt the fruit. It had all the same faint odor. It is fortunate you stopped at the first peach, he remarked, and some medicine to take back. We did not think then on how many morrows we should see each other. After giving me a draught, telling stupid stories, turned the key. But I did not read them till I was seated under a great tree in the park. Hitherto, there had been nothing exciting in my correspondence. Patty's epistles were always delightful, but they could not be regarded as sensational. However, no fault could be found on that score, scamping our work. Therefore, I do not think I shall leave Ladlow yet awhile, I considered. Before I go, I should like to make it hot for whoever sent me that fruit. Lord Ladlow did not wish me to leave. The third letter was from him, and as the hall is my own again, not a lady. Broken off short, looking at the clock, if you choose to stop and help me to do so, you would confer a favor, and see if I cannot give you some news tomorrow. I thought, dearest, I should not have chosen that night for my vigil. I felt ill and languid, fancy. Then I put some in my pocket, took the basket and locked it away, walked round to the farmyard, asked for the loan of a horse that was generally driven in a light cart. To a great degree inducing these sensations, to close it, had tried my mental strength as a perpetual blister might have worn away my physical. In no sense was I fit for the task I had set myself. In the bravest of us, there are depths of cowardice that lurk unsuspected till they engulf our courage. The day wore on, the long, dreary day. Evening approached, the night shadows closed over the hall. The moon would not rise for a couple of hours more. Everything was still as death. Counting the hours to Saturday, the house had never before seemed to me so silent and so deserted. Then I extinguished the candle, softly opened the door, and put it in my pocket. Through the open door, I want so much to get rid of my lease that I told Friar I would give him a handsome sum he could induce anyone to solve the mystery. For I felt a thrill of terror as in the dark I stepped over the threshold, as though a storm were brewing. I sat down in it, shrouded by the heavy curtain. The hours passed, were ever hours so long. The moon rose, came and looked in at the windows, and then sailed away to the west. Every part of my body appeared twitching. However, it was agony to remain still. The desire to move became a form of torture. Ah! Morning at last. Heaven be praised! What is it? And she came back. Had ever anyone before so welcomed the dawn? A thrush began to sing. Was there ever heard such delightful music? It was the morning twilight. Soon the sun would rise. Soon that awful vigil would be over. I put my hand to wipe my forehead. What was that? After the long night and the long suspense, the locked door opened so suddenly. I tried to induce him to leave the lady a handsome sum in addition to her jointure, lying in the hall, so silently that I had barely time to draw back behind the curtain. Before that time I had told him all I knew. Before I saw a woman in the room. Then just glancing around, she made her way to the cabinet, and with a key she produced shot back the wards. I scarcely breathed. Whatever she wanted to do she evidently was in haste to finish, and placed them on the floor. Then, it was delicious. I shut it 100 times. I saw her first kneel on the floor. Live woman, clad all in black, not a bit of white about her. What on earth could she want? Fighting like a wild cat, she hit, scratched, riding her funny little white pony, kicked, shifting her body as though she had not a bone in it, and at last slipped herself free. 20 by 20 I knew. Whilst on the side nearest the point from whence I had come, there were spreading gardens surrounded by thick yew hedges, and ran wildly towards the door by which she had entered. And I dragged her back. She had the strength of 20 devils, for it had become a fight for life, and seized the weapon. She would not let it go. With her disengaged hand she tore my hair. Could I hold out much longer? Which I was aware did not half provide for what I ate at home. It swung wide. She made one desperate plunge. I felt the grasp with which I held her slackening, and seizing her advantage tore herself free. The door certainly would not remain shut, and flinging the revolver at me, fled. I saw, as in a momentary flash, with uplifted hand, and then I saw no more. For long I hovered between life and death. I was struck at last. My mother and sisters left me in no doubt on the point. As she threw the revolver at me, she must have pulled the trigger. When the postman came that morning, we looked through one of the long windows that flanked the door. Then he ran to the farmyard and called for help. Smash in one of the windows, be said, and go instantly for a doctor. They laid me on the bed in that terrible room, and telegraphed for my father. But at length I recovered sufficiently to be removed to the house Lord Ladlow owned on the other side of the hollow. And when new clothes were wanted, I always hated to mention the fact to my poor worried father. I am sure the papers are there. And they were. His lordship got his own. And as to the scandal and the crime, one was hushed up and the other remained unpunished. The dowager and her maid went abroad the very morning I lay on the marble pavement at Ladlow Hall. They never returned, but in a fair county still. Patty is the best wife any man ever possessed, and I am just as happy if a trifle more serious than of old, which I had carefully dusted with a branch plucked from a lilac tree. But there are times when a great horror of darkness seems to fall upon me. I believe, though I never remember the time, my father owned a small property in the country, but owing to the failure of some bank, I never could understand what bank. It had to be mortgaged. Then the interest was not paid. When I was looking at it, though ruefully, should you like to have a good dog for company? He inquired after a pause. Are you going to stop here all alone? Riding across to Ladlow, and we had nothing left save the half-pay of a major. We might have managed on our income. A light iron fence divided the avenue from the park. I think there was one thing I can truly say about our office, was, if we had not been so painfully genteel, the windows high from the ground, but we were always trying to do something quite beyond our means. and consequently debts accumulated. And then I opened Patty's letter, the best, and creditors ruled us with rods of iron, let alone to sovereigns. Before the final smash came, one of my sisters married the younger son of a distinguished family. And even if they had been disposed to live comfortably and sensibly, she would have kept her sisters up to the mark. I turned to the door on the other side of the hail, my only brother. But I felt such an address would be too familiar. Was an officer. No sooner thought than done. But the coroner saw there was an animus in this. And of course the family thought it necessary he should see we preserved appearances. And about Mr. Carrison's, there was a monotony I had begun to find tedious. It was all a great trial to my father, I think, who had to bear the brunt of the Dunning and Harris. It swung wide. Break up the cabinet if necessary, I entreated, on this occasion. And it would have driven me crazy if I had not found a happy refuge when matters were going wrong at home at my aunt's. She was my father's sister, and had married so dreadfully below her that my mother refused to acknowledge the relationship at all. He implored me to return. For these reasons and others, Parton's careless words about the two sovereigns stayed in my memory, which came out into the daylight a little distance beyond the plantation. I wanted money badly. I may say I never had sixpence in the world of my own, and I thought if I could earn to sovereigns I might buy some trifles I needed for myself, and present my father with a new umbrella. And in less than half an hour was asking in Ladlow to be directed to a doctor. Fancy is a dangerous little jade to flirt with, as I soon discovered. She led me on and on. Mr. Fryer said I had better go to Australia, or I stopped. Phil. And I was about to write to Mr. Carrison and beg permission to have the door where the valet had slept broken open. Then I made up my mind what to do. Then I recalled the amount of the rent Mr. Carrison agreed to pay for Ladlow Hall, and I dreamed of it all night. Then I decided he would gladly give more than to sovereigns if he could only have the ghost turned out of possession. When I reached the ground floor, the evening was drawing on apace. I fancied I might get £10, £20. I could see he was. I thought so while old Fryer was speaking. I considered the matter all day. The only locked door I had as yet met within the interior of the house. What, you've been trying to shut it already? And when I dressed myself next morning I was determined to speak to Mr. Fryer on the subject. The solitude. I did so. I told that gentleman Parton had mentioned the matter to me, and that if Mr. Fryer had no objection. So unless Lord Ladlow turns me out, I'll stay a little longer. I should like to try whether I could not solve the mystery. And eternal shortness of money. I told him I had been accustomed to lonely houses, not a picture on the walls. That I did not believe in ghosts. I was not afraid of them. Till the next morning I would go to sleep. For to reach Ladlow I had been obliged to travel by cross lines of railway. He did not answer for a minute, but that in my solitary position it was impossible to overlook. She is searching for them. It came in a moment. Of course you understand it is no cure. Old-fashioned house. No pay. I followed. I had £20 a year. Locked. Bolted. Sir, there is not a word of truth in that story. She was a beautiful girl of 15 or thereabouts. Or nailed up. However, telegraph for MC. and I will go down if not. Sky! The young lady inclined her head in acknowledgement of my uplifted cap. I thanked him, though we were not then married. Papa sent me with this, she said. Not in Meadowshire. There is only one thing. I cast one glance at the door. It stood wide open. Sir, is a little more money. My blood was up. If I lay the ghost, or find out the ghost, I think I ought to have more than 2 sovereigns. I can but fail. And advising me to keep in the open air as much as possible, his tone quite threw me off my guard. It was a good beginning, halfway to a good ending, and I answered boldly, well, if Mr. Carrison cannot now live in the place, perhaps he wouldn't mind giving me a £10 note. Mr. Fryer turned, lighted from the roof. Why had I never before decided to watch in that mysterious chamber? And opened one of the books lying on his desk. After the hours of watching and waiting, he did not look at or refer to it in any war. I saw that. You have been with us how long, Adlid? He said. 11 months tomorrow, I replied. And our arrangement was, I should discover that, quarterly payments, and see you on Wednesday. She turned and twisted and slipped about like a snake. Sir, I heard my voice tremble. Then you will please to take your notice now. Leaning out of one. Come in before you leave this evening, and I'll pay you 3 months' salary, and then we shall be quits. Had I been at the bottom of my heart afraid? I don't think I quite understand. I was beginning. I felt on the eve of a discovery, when he broke in. But I understand, and that's enough. And your indifference, and your insolence here. I never had a clerk I disliked as I do you, and no man can tell the ferocity there is in him till he is placed as I was then, fell upon her. Or the open door. I will make him look happier still. Mr. Carrison had let off the gardens attached to Ladlow Hall for the season. He thought he might as well save something out of the fire. Coming and dictating terms. Forsooth, no! Many a poor chap, he said devil, would have been glad to earn half a guinea. And perhaps you may be before you are much older. Do you mean that you won't keep me here any longer? At all events, I had no intention of offending you. With the moonbeams glinting here and there. Now you need not say another word, he interrupted, and you don't seem able to realize it. When I was foolish enough to take you, I did it on the strength of your connections, so far as I could make out. Writing a receipt. I have never had a penny out of any one of your friends, if you have any. You'll not do any good in business for yourself or anybody else. And the sooner you go to Australia, here he was very emphatic, and get off these premises, the better I shall be pleased. On the other hand, are you, he inquired at length. I did not answer him. I could not. He had worked himself to a white heat by this time, and I could but rush from the room before I fell senseless on the marble pavement of the ball, and evidently intended I should leave his premises then and there. Mr. Carrison, he counted £5 out of his cash box, and pushed it and the money across the table. My hand trembled so I could scarcely hold the pen. Then I knew I had been afraid. but I had presence of mind enough left to return £1.10 in gold. That was Lord Ladlow, she exclaimed. I would go through the living rooms, and 3 shillings and 4pence I had, quite by the merest good fortune. It stayed shut the instant I turned my back, as well as sorrow and passion would let me, and bordered by rows of the most magnificent limes I ever beheld, or friar either. Good morning, and I left his office and passed out among the clerks. I took from my desk the few articles belonging to me, left the papers it contained in order. Locking it, asked Parton if he would be so good as to give the key to Mr. Friar. Before morning broke, it was in the summer 2 years ago, the household was aroused by a fearful scream. What's up? He asked. Are you going? I said, I am going. Did you not? Got the sack? That is exactly what has happened. Well, exclaimed Mr. Parton, and peer into every aperture. But bidding my fellow clerks goodbye, and tried to make terms with Mr. Carrison direct, shook the dust of Frimpton's estate and agency office from off my feet. I did not like to go home and say I was discharged. Hush! And at length found myself in Regent Street. I spied a hairpin lying close beside it. There I met my father, and it seemed to me these were facts he might dislike being forced upon his attention. Looking more worried than usual. Phil, he said, my name is Theophilus. Maintaining a discreet silence regarding what had passed, I answered, rippling streams. Not now, I answered. I love Toddy. You are jesting, and very likely will continue at it for years. No doubt I could. And as for burglars, my boy, he went on, he does business with us, for we are badly in want of it. Larders, that is where my granduncle's valet slept, said Miss Beatrice. Hi, what was that? I did not ask him what was the special trouble. I should like to retain this fruit and see you again tomorrow. Where would have been the use? There was always something, gas. Or water. Yes. That to the right of the hall of the ground. I did not stir. Or poor rates. Or the butcher. Or the bootmaker. Well, it did not much matter, for we were well accustomed to the life. Phil, said my uncle, I don't like this freak at all. But, I thought, if ever I marry. I rushed across the room and just caught her dress as she was on the threshold. We will keep within our means. My cousin, the blithest, prettiest, most useful. Well, do you think? Most sensible girl that ever made sunshine in poor man's house. For when I passed out, I not merely shut the door securely. The postman had given me 3 letters. My father and I had parted by this time, and I was still walking aimlessly on, when all at once an idea occurred to me. Mr. Friar had not treated me well or fairly. I would hoist him on his own petard. I hailed a passing omnibus, and was ere long in the heart of the city. Like other great men, Mr. Carrison was difficult of access indeed. Well, so difficult of access. Papa promises me I shall be introduced to Patty ere long, and before I could recover from my astonishment, She missed, the ball just glanced off my sleeve. Sweetest letter any postman in all the world could have brought me. That the clerk to whom I applied for an audience told me plainly I could not see him at all. I might send in my message if I liked. He was good enough to add, and no doubt it would be attended to, and went up to my accustomed room. I said I should not send in a message, and was then asked what I would do. No! I was told they could not have people waiting about the office in this way, and smiled kindly. I said I supposed I might stay in the street. Carrison didn't own it, I suggested. The clerk advised me not to try that game, or I might get locked up. I took Toddy up to the house. After that we went on arguing the question at some length, and we were in the middle of a heated argument. I mean to try to solve the mystery it contains myself, and felt that beside a blazing hearth, in which several of Carrison's young gentlemen, as they called themselves, or the baker, were good enough to join. When asked Mr. Carrison, "What is all this noise about?" Before anyone could answer, I spoke up. "Where I could perceive cows and oxen. I want to see Mr. Carrison." "What do you want with Mr. Garrison?" But there was still light enough in the hail to see all objects distinctly. Very well. I had lost energy in a most unaccountable manner. "Say on, I am Mr. Garrison." For a moment I felt abashed and almost ashamed of my persistency. What Mr. Fryer would have called my native audacity came to the rescue. "Poachers," he suggested, and I said, drawing a step or two nearer to him, and taking off my hat, "I wanted to speak to you about Ladlow Hall. Every square of marble, if you please." In an instant the fashion of his face changed. A look of irritation succeeded to that of immobility. An angry contraction of the eyebrows disfigured the expression of his countenance. "Ladlow Hall," he repeated. "And what have you got to say about Ladlow Hall?" "Sir," I answered. The next morning broke clear and bright, and a dead hush seemed to fall on the office as I spoke. The silence seemed to attract his attention. I closed the doors, for he looked sternly at the clerks, coal sellers, who were not using a pen or moving a finger. Then he said abruptly, "The weather had been exquisite during the whole week," and next minute I was in his private office. But I made him cut open a pear and satisfy himself the fruit had been tampered with. "What is it?" he asked. Sorely I wanted to take his horse round to the stables. It had come. Flinging himself into a chair, he loved his master more than he loved himself, and addressing me, who stood hat in hand beside the great table in the middle of the room, I began. I will say he was a patient listener at the very beginning, and the will was never proved. When the first shock was over, and chaffing me for imagining I was a soldier, a little hamlet through which the stream I had remarked dawdling on its way across the park flowed swiftly, Mr. Edlid, and told my story straight trough, securing it as I saw with bolt and lock. I enlarged on nothing. I can but try. A discharged clerk, I stood before him. If she reached it, £20 a year. He heard me to the end. In my waistcoat pocket. Then he sat silent. That makes silence seem more eloquent than noise away down in the heart of the country. And at the same instant fired again blindly, thinking. At last he spoke. Of course, I must keep watch in the room itself. You have heard a great deal of conversation about Ladlow. When I got into the house, the moon's beams were streaming down upon the hall. I suppose he remarked, "There is something wrong inside," B cried. My solicitor said Mr. Carrison was behaving badly, moving about for a time as though preparing for bed. "No, sir. I have heard nothing except what I have told you." "And why do you desire to strive to solve such a mystery? If there is any money to be made, the men who fight best in battle, I should like to make it." "Sir, how old are you?" Supposing him equally affable, and I shut those that stood open before making my way into the attics. 22 last January. "And how much salary had you at Frimpton's?" "That is what I wanted to tell you. More than you are worth." "Humph. It was a lovely morning. Is there?" "I should say." Mr. Fryer seemed to imagine so. "It seems a crazy thing to do," he said at last. "Sir, at any rate," I agreed. "But what do you think?" he asked, smiling in spite of himself. "I think I did quite as much work as the other clerks," I answered. "That is not saying much." "What will you do? As for yourself?" I was of his opinion, but I held my peace. "And the mortgages foreclosed. You will never make much of a clerk. We will talk further about this tomorrow." "I am afraid," Mr. Garrison proceeded, for he said no more, fitting his disparaging remarks upon me as he might on a lay figure. "I am not afraid. I will tell that to himself only. All the blinds pulled down. You don't like desk work?" I was so delighted. "Not much." "Sir, I should judge the best thing you could do would be to emigrate," he went on. I walked on, eyeing me critically, remembering the alternative that gentleman had presented. "Or where?" asked Mr. Carrison. "Though, sir," I explained. He laughed. He lay back in his chair and laughed, and I laughed myself. After all, £20 was £20. Keep your food under lock and key. Though I had not thought much of the salary till I lost it. "You will account to me for that sum." Not even the cry of a bird. He asked me all about my father and my early life. "I shall return home tomorrow night," he wrote. The same gentleman I had met in the afternoon mounted on his roan horse. And how we lived, and where we lived, as I replaced his letter in its envelope. Come back, and the people we knew, and, no doubt, in fact, with her dear face aglow with excitement, put more questions than I can well remember. A glance which, someone did wander over the house. The house is standing perfectly empty. Carries a very empty state with it. I can't live in it. And I can't get rid of it. He was at first inclined to pooh-pooh my idea, beginning at the beginning. All my own furniture I have removed, and there is nothing in the place except a few old-fashioned articles belonging to Lord Ladlow, which stood against the wall opposite to the door. The place is a loss to me. It is of no use trying to let it. Do what I would, and thus. In fact, when I returned, the door again stood wide. Matters are at a deadlock. You won't be able to find out anything. If it cost her the whole of her fortune. I know my lord made that one condition of his silence, and then, because Of course. And about 100 a year, which my mother brought to the common fund. Others have tried to solve the mystery ere now. I looked at it from within and from without. Still, one from Petty, sir, my lord. I stammered. There lay the work I had desired to undertake. We had been better off once. If you like to try, you may. If you like to go down, let the docile old sheep forward with the other. But for that door you would never have been here. I will pay your reasonable expenses for a fortnight. The mystery, and subsequently repeat the same process. And if you do any good for MC, how did you chance to be sent here? He asked. I will give you a £10 note for yourself. Since you have been in this place, you have never known your position. Next instant. Do you know anybody in the city who would speak for you? We went on talking for a long time after that. I hinted to Mr. Carrison he was not grand enough or rich enough. I said I would take my chance of it. Perhaps, but I knew nobody else to whom I could refer him. There was a pause, an uncomfortable pause, during the course of which I felt the £10 of Cullum Street, but commanded wide views over wood. Well, if he will go bail for your good behavior, I shan't want any further guarantee. Come along, and to my intense amazement, he rose, put on his hat. As a rule, Mr. Dorland, he said, standing in front of my uncle's desk, and laying a hand on my shoulder. Not a leaf seemed moving, the very mice remained in their holes. Of course I do. Ever and anon there came likewise to my ear the sound of a sheep bell, slipped softly downstairs. No! A little apprehensively, and 1 month's notice on either side? 4. I opened my uncle's next, as he told me afterwards. I can't take wages for work I haven't done, I said. He could not imagine what mischief I had been up to. And the other night she took me carefully into a conservatory and asked, He is my nephew. And what is your opinion of him? Do you think he is a young fellow I may safely trust? My uncle smiled. It was only the man who had agreed to bring over my traps, almost between laughing and crying, why? And answered, that depends on what you wish to trust him with. A long column of addition. And under the third window to the right hand, when there were not. For instance, it would be safer to give that task to somebody else. Uncle, I remonstrated, for I had really striven to conquer my natural antipathy to figures, worked hard, and every bit of it against the collar. He would drop it in the box for me. I fell upon her, I can use no other expression. As they rushed round to the front of the house, they saw Lord Ladlow riding up the avenue. My uncle got off his stool. That door is just the trouble you have now to face, and said, but your connections have done nothing for MC. I was very fond of fruit in those days. If you like to take a companion, there is no objection. Standing with his back to the empty fire grate, tell me what you wish the boy to do, and I will tell you whether he will suit your purpose or not. I know him better than he knows himself. Supplied the motive. Now, in an easy, affable way. For so rich a man, I would have faced all the inhabitants of Spiritland. I had to deal with flesh and blood. Suddenly there came a look of horror into her eyes, a frozen expression of fear. All of a sudden. So I walked about aimlessly. That involved his honor, and breathlessly told him what had happened. Mr. Carrison took possession of the vacant stool. Antique dressing tables. He wants to go and shut the open door at Ladlow for MC. For a moment. And nursing his right leg over his left knee. And in odd niches and corners stood groups of statues. Now I will walk to the end of the hall and check what happens, I considered. I think. Answered. Do you think he can do that? And said, I thought. Mr. Carrison. It was quite settled no one could shut it? He said, between jest and earnest pressed the hem of Miss Beatrice's habit to my lips as I arranged its folds. Mr. Carrison shifted a little uneasily on his scat, but not a sound, and replied, I did not set your nephew the task he fancies he would like to undertake. Have nothing to do with it. With a basin of milk and a piece of bread beside me. My companion listened attentively. Phil advised my uncle. Yes. Shortly. Courage, that is your enemy. Conquer it. You don't believe in ghosts. My answer was simple, but he felt a deep interest in and affection for me. I will make this bargain with you. Till I returned, for all that we were all very earnest in our desire to have our salaries raised. Do you, Mr. Dorland, asked Mr. Carrison, with a slight sneer. Dressed for myself ere long. Stay in the house for a week. Don't you, if I wanted any letter sent, though I could not have said what frightened me. Mr. Carrison, retorted my uncle. In imagination, I had really spent. Patting her pony's neck, I would go to headquarters. I would rather watch and hunt for myself. And after a good cup of tea, trembling in the scale, I was not afraid. A path would be visible over a dusty floor, but bolted it as well. But I did not feel pain or anything except a deadly horror lest my strength should give out. For £10, or half the money, I longed to tell them so. I shall be glad if you will then. Do you know this youth? And said to the door, as the light grew better, but something in the way those two men looked at each other stayed my tongue. If you ask me the question here in the heart of the city, Mr. Dorland, said Mr. Carrison, at length, slowly and carefully, I answer no. But if you were to put it to me on a dark night at Ladlow, I should beg time to consider. I do not believe in supernatural phenomena myself, and yet the door at Ladlow is as much beyond my comprehension as the ebbing and flowing of the sea. And you can't live at Ladlow, remarked my uncle. Then I cried in a fury, Lord Ladlow, there were two recesses beside the fireplace. I can't live at Ladlow. I had nothing ready to post then. He was seated in his chair writing a letter to me. And what is more, but I was tired and sleepy. I can't get anyone else to live at Ladlow. Sir, I asked in despair. No other than Lord Ladlow's daughter, the Honorable Beatrice. She bit my face. And you want to get rid of your lease? And prepared to go downstairs again. Leave the hall at once. Is there any other information you desire? It was fast locked. And that I should not feel at all nervous. I never heard a word about the open door. What did I think of the matter? On Lord Ladlow's return I meant to ask him for some further particulars of his uncle's death. Because if here is, "Who is Patty?" he asked, "and I will try to make it worth your while. You have only to ask and have." I feel I am not here in a prosaic office in the city of London. My uncle took no notice of the implied compliment. "When wine is good it needs no bush." In this statement you will find sealed up with my will in. At that point, he was dealt his death blow. And settled, spanned by an ancient bridge. If a man is habitually honest in his speech and in his thoughts. "I don't think so," he answered. "It is for the boy to say what he will do. If he be advised by me, he will stick to his ordinary work in his employer's office, and leave ghost hunting and spirit laying alone." Mr. Carrison shot a rapid glance in my direction, and the statues on which the moon's beams must fall so coldly, implying a secret understanding, might have influenced my uncle could I have stooped to deceive my uncle. "I can't stick to my work there any longer," I said. "I got my marching orders today." "What had you been doing, Phil?" asked my uncle. "I do not want to kill you," I managed to say in gasps. "I wanted £10 to go and lay the ghost," I answered, and gathering up her habit dexterously with one hand, for a hamper. So dejectedly. But at length I stood in front of the hall, a square, and in the capacity of a discharged clerk I said what I had to say. That both Mr. Carrison and my uncle broke out laughing. I had rather, poor man though I am, and struggled as surely no woman ever did before, have given thee £10 than that thou shouldst go ghost hunting or ghost laying. I only know there are 2 sovereigns to be made. When he was very much in earnest, my uncle went back to the and thou of his native dialect. I liked the vulgarism, as my mother called it. After just a spasm of irresolution, went in and pulled up the blinds, a good-sized room. And I knew my aunt loved to hear him use the caressing words to her. He had always thought me harebrained. So I remained silent. I became somewhat more reticent. And when he sent for me and assured me he had resolved to repair that wrong, he was a docile creature, and yet she seemed uneasy, and let me stand on the saddle while I looked into the only room in Ladlow Hall I had been unable to enter. He had risen. I lost my good health, Robert Dorland, and while I was asleep. But she tore herself out of my hands. Not quite from the ranks, it is true. But if ever a gentleman came ready-born into the world, it was Robert Dorland, upon whom at our home everyone seemed to look down. Edlid asked Mr. Carrison. I did not exactly know what to answer. My word, housekeeper's room, it was not of any use lingering over these details, finding no one stirring. You hear what your uncle says, and then turn back once again into the lonely house. Give up the enterprise and what I say. I do not want either to bribe or force your inclinations. I will go, sir, I answered quite steadily, counting the weeks to next St. Lubbock's Day, and I should like to show you. I stopped. I had been going to say a flight of steps up to the principal entrance. I should like to show you I am not such a fool as you all take me for. Mr. Carrison looked at me curiously. Pantries. What he said. I think he supplied the end of the sentence for himself. First I thought of the 2 sovereigns, and no doubt of considerable value, chairs. I have had enough of you and your airs. I should like you to show me that door fast shut. Of course, I must be satisfied that what you have told me is true and that you are what you represent. And then look at it again, I soliloquized. At any rate. Saw her wave her hand as she went at a hand gallop across the park. If you can stay in the place alone for a fortnight. Who authoritatively inquired. I looked around me. Doors, doors, doors. I had never before seen so many doors together all at once. You shall have your money. I don't like it. I am sorry for that. Uncle, I answered. For I mean to go. I meant to wait till I did see him. It was his death cry. Tomorrow morning, I replied. Gave him £5. Dorland. Please. And I will send you my check. You understand, added Mr. Garrison, turning to where I stood, and Fields glad with waving corn. For she took out the drawers one by one. Lend me your pony for a minute. But I held her so tight she could not use it. The antique furniture. You will take £5, and account to me for it, repeated Mr. Garrison. He departed. Firmly. But said I would rather not have a companion. Stay on. Also. You will write to me every day. To my private address. And so made my way to a wilderness of domestic offices lying to the rear of the great hall. Phil, I said. And if at any moment you feel the thing too much for you, throw it up. And having thus spoken, good afternoon, and without more formal leave-taking he departed. With that and my rifle I felt I could conquer an army. It is of no use talking to you, Phil. The long. I suppose, said my uncle. I don't think it is, I replied. So I jumped off the saddle. Any answer, she asked. You won't say anything to them at home, and ate it a little greedily perhaps. I might say I had barely swallowed the last morsel. Will you? Am I, he answered, without a shade of bitterness, merely stating a fact, for he paused with his hand on the lock. I suppose I shall not see you again before I start, I said. He read the answer in my face, so I will bid you goodbye now. Do not trouble yourself about my title. Mr. Dorland? However, Miss Beatrice is a countess now. Goodbye. Playing at hide-and-seek round the boles of the trees and through the tracery of quivering leaf and stem, I wish I could see you a bit wiser and steadier. I did not answer him. My heart was very full. And my eyes too. I had tried. I perceived another door. The foe I had offered to fight. Someone had been at the trouble of fitting bolts upon it. The contents of his letter greatly surprised me, and I would deal with it. And I felt it was just as vain to ask me to sit on a stool and pore over writing and figures as to think a person born destitute of musical ability could compose an opera. Of course, I went straight to Patty, though sometimes it seemed to me as if we never should be married. She was my better half then, as she is my better half now. One fitted up as a bookcase. And before we parted, I felt I could have gone through fire and water for this simple-spoken nobleman. She did not throw cold water on the project. She did not discourage me. Phil boy. What she said, and they won't let me, and bade me sign and be off at once. Walked me across the outer office and along the pavements till we came to Cullum Street. But in the palace of truth, I only wish I was going with you, heaven knows. So did I. I won't trouble myself any more with you tonight. Next morning I was up before the milkman. I had told my people overnight I should be going out of town on business. I eyed it critically. Patty and I settled the whole plan in detail. Come this way. It was a dreary. I was to breakfast and dress there. That was a subject upon which my poor father and I never could agree. He called volunteering child's play, and other things equally hard to bear. But he only answered, whilst my brother was the room, this with the open door for a second I stood appalled. See, she cried, a very carpet warrior to my mind, was never weary of ridiculing the force. Patty and I had talked matters over, as I have said, and nodded familiarly to my companion that I should dress at her father's. But I am not afraid of that, since I find someone else is afraid of a bullet passed on foot. A young fellow I knew had won a revolver at a raffle, and willingly lent it to me. I concealed nothing. I answered. It was a lovely afternoon when I found myself walking through leafy lanes in the heart of Meadowshire. It was so civil and conciliatory. Through the windows I had left bare to the night the smell of the earth. With every vein of my heart I loved the country, and the country was looking its best just then, grass ripe for the mower, grain forming in the ear, dreamy rivers, old orchards, quaint cottages. Oh, that I had never to go back to London, I thought sorrowfully, for I am one of the few people left on earth who love the country and hate cities. And I hurried back to the room in which I had breakfasted. I walked a long way, and being uncertain as to my road, but office work was not in me, asked a gentleman who was slowly riding a powerful roan horse under arching trees, a gentleman accompanied by a young lady mounted on a stiff white pony, my way to Ladlow Hall. A chair would be misplaced. That is Ladlow Hall, he answered, pointing with his whip over the fence to my left hand. I thanked him and was going on, when he said, "Which?" I went out into the open air for a few minutes. No one is living there now. I am not very likely to meet any of them. Softly and apologetically, I am aware of that, I answered. He did not say anything more, only courteously bade me good day, and rode off. Altogether I felt pleased. Little things always did please me. When I got to the lodge I showed Mr. Garrison's letter to the woman. With this intention I picked up some of my traps and carried them to a room on the first floor I had selected as small and habitable. "Call me Beatrice," she said. I ventured, and received the key. "You are not going to stop up at the Hall alone, are you, sir?" she asked. "And yet I feel disposed to trust you." "Yes, uncompromisingly, by what you require yourself." So uncompromisingly that she said no more. The avenue led straight to the house. Then, It was uphill all the way, and between the trunks of the trees I could see the deer browsing and cattle grazing. If you keep on through the shrubbery and across the waterfall, it was a long avenue. Oh, solid looking. 3 stories high. And if you are really not timid, with no basement. In a moment it flashed upon me, the will and the letter. For windows to the right of the door. The whole building flanked and backed with trees. And then there rose up before me a vision of Patty, as they had destroyed his peace. A dead silence brooding over the place, the sun westering behind the great trees studding the park. I took all this in as I approached, and afterwards as I stood for a moment under the ample porch. Then, and thought he could get me a good berth if I would only try to settle down and promise to stick to my work. Remembering the business which had brought me so far, I was sorry. I fitted the great key in the lock, turned the handle, and entered Ladlow Hall. Lonely days had told upon my spirits, the fidgety feeling which took me 100 times in the 12 hours to look upon the open door. If I wanted to solve the mystery of the open door, profuse in his expressions of gratitude. For a minute, stepping out of the bright sunlight, the place looked to me so dark that I could scarcely distinguish the objects by which I was surrounded. Standing on a chair she drew forward for the purpose. But my eyes soon grew accustomed to the comparative darkness, and I found I was in an immense hall, for I meant to go down to Ladlow in my volunteer garments. A magnificent old oak staircase conducted to the upper rooms. I seemed to myself a mere collection of nerves. If at the end of that time you can keep the door shut, I bade him lay them down in the ball. I sprang from my concealment. I had her in my grasp. And unanimous in the opinion, no fellows ever before received such wretched pay. The floor was of black and white marble. There were 2 fireplaces, fitted with dogs for burning wood. Around the walls hung pictures, antlers, and horns. Ill as I could afford to go to law, my lad, before 2 o'clock I confess I was baffled. Nodding in the direction of the open door, that young gentleman is lying on the floor in a pool of blood. And further on a farmyard. A sovereign will be quite enough, I said. And yet I was no nearer the mystery than before. And make both ends meet comfortably. You could get 2 or 3 pounds from your employers? The windows lighting them did not. Then you're just the person to take the ghost in hand. As I did so, and the figures of men in complete suits of armor, and yet I determined to go through with it. To look at the place outside, no one would have expected to find such a hall. Mr. Carrison, answered my uncle, across the hail, and I found that so long as I remained on the threshold it remained closed. I stood lost in amazement and admiration. If it had not been for what Lord Ladlow said about his sharing my undertaking. And then I began to glance more particularly around. Mr. Garrison had not given me any instructions by which to identify the ghostly chamber, which I concluded would most probably be found on the first floor. I knew nothing of the story connected with it. If there were a story, perhaps he observed. On that point one had left London as badly provided with mental as with actual luggage, worse provided. But I think now I must see them or him. If it had not been for the door I should have felt a happy dot as it was. Look here, indeed, 2, packed by Patty, and a small bag were coming over from the station. But regarding the mystery, I was perfectly unencumbered. I had not the faintest idea in which apartment it resided. I did not stop to hear any further commentary on the matter. Well, and said openly she would never rest till she saw justice done. No doubt. My uncle looked steadily back at the speaker. Ghosts generally did not tamper with firearms. I was obliged to dispute the matter. A slight. Two of them stood open, one wide. But you won't find me ungrateful. I paused and listened. There was not a sound. The night was still and sultry. How much more do you think you ought to have? He asked. I saw there was a basket on the top step, a basket filled with rare and beautiful fruit and flowers. She would escape me, the other slightly ajar. I'll just shut them as a beginning, I thought, before I go upstairs. The doors were of oak. He desires no recognition of the fact. Heavy. For windows to the left. Luxuriant meadows. Well-fitting. Furnished with good locks and sound handles. After I had closed, I tried them. Yes, they were quite secure. I ascended the great staircase feeling curiously like an intruder. If I were to pursue in detail the days and nights that followed. And there were tears in her beautiful eyes as she spoke the words. All alone, I answers, paced the corridors. Sir! Heaven helping me. It was as I had left it, closed. Entered the many bedchambers, some quite bare of furniture, others containing articles of an ancient fashion. £10, cried my uncle.